Thing people don't oftentimes realize is the relationship between trauma and procrastination, or toxic stress and procrastination. And procrastination is an incredibly pervasive, yet somewhat benign issue for many. We don't oftentimes think of procrastination being a really significant or dramatic mental health issue. Nevertheless, it's a pain in the ass to deal with, and a lot of people feel really burdened by it. But oftentimes we struggle to understand the causation or the correlation between the two. And so I want to help explain how this might be a big part of your experience and why you might be procrastinating. So what we know, for anybody who's ever procrastinated shit, you have a deadline, you've got something to do, you've got, an outrageous to-do list, and you are in avoidance. We know that procrastination does a couple things. Number one, it causes anxiety. It chips away at your mental real estate, in the sense that even though you might be distracting yourself and doing something else, you're consistently, kind of listening or thinking about it in the back of your head. So it's got to be done, but you're just not tending to it. Therefore, it's sucking, a certain degree of mental bandwidth or energy away from you. We also know that it releases the stress hormone, cortisol. So many people would be like, well, why would I fucking do that if I don't like to feel any of those things? I don't like to be anxious. I don't like to feel stressed and overwhelmed. Why would I procrastinate? So what might be happening is you might have a little addiction on board to cortisol itself. And the reason for that is because, number one, cortisol is incredibly addictive. Although unhealthy, it is addictive. So what happens is when we have a history of trauma or abuse, or we grow up in an environment where there is chronic or toxic stress, we start to release the hormone cortisol regularly. So all day, every day. And the reason for that is that it is a mechanism that we use physiologically to cope with either the internal or environmental factors that are causing us distress, right? So it's that fight or flight response. What happens though is that over time, when you either are experiencing, compounded trauma or chronic stress or chronic anxiety, this fight or flight response just kind of stays on overdrive all the time, right? There's no off switch. And so what that means is that cortisol is running through your system regularly, yet abnormally. And what you will start to do neurobiologically is build or cultivate a landscape to support this influx of cortisol that's now becoming part of your normal baseline. So fast forward several years later, what I had spoken to you about in the beginning of the video about being addicted to cortisol, what happens is we actually neurobiologically and physiologically build a landscape that not only encourages cortisol, but it actually requires it. So now what we have is we have physiology that's actually addicted to cortisol. So let's say you have early childhood trauma, you grow up in a toxic environment, stressed out in early years. Again, we fast forward that several years later, you're an adult now, and you may not have the same stressors that you had growing up. However, you have physiology that says, I need cortisol. So what we will do now is we will go out into our adult lives and we will recreate scenarios to help facilitate this chemical process. This happens oftentimes too with kids in classroom settings, for example, that grow up in really stressful environments. We put them in a classroom setting. They have an influx of cortisol happening through their system, and we put them in a scenario where they're expected to pay attention, be quiet, sit still, etc. Meanwhile, they have physiology on board that says, I need cortisol, I need the stress hormone, I need that release. And so what does a kid do? It has an outburst. It kicks the kid in front of them. It throws a, paper airplane, etc. And then they get to have that chemical fix. And then we diagnose them with ADD and behavioral issues, etc. That's a whole different video though. So for adults, oftentimes what will manifest are these maladaptive behaviors, or we will recreate scenarios to get this chemical fix, just like any other drug addiction. So procrastination provides just that. So as I had mentioned, it is very addicting in terms of our relationship to cortisol. So for many people who have a history of trauma, although the trauma might not be present in their everyday experience right now, they will choose a job that's really stressful because it releases that chemical. They will choose outrageous, or they will, create outrageous tasks or goal setting that can feel really, really challenging to meet because inevitably it releases that stress hormone. They take on too much, right? And spread themselves really thin. I am, a proponent of that because it releases that chemical. And so part of these behaviors, procrastination being one of them, is your body's effort to maintain or sustain this sort of chemical pattern that you have created over the course of your lifetime. So as much as that sounds really shitty and you're like, oh fuck, what do I do now? Because I'm literally neurobiologically and physiologically wired for drama and trauma. Know that A, you can correct this, B, you can pivot it, and C, everybody has access to healing. But it's important to understand why these behaviors are in place, and that oftentimes it's not just because you're fucked up or you're lazy or you don't know any better. It's oftentimes a physiological response, right? Working in tandem to create these behaviors. So we discussed this a lot in Life Camp. Ruby and I, what we co-facilitate, which is a 10-week program, trauma-informed program. We're doing our next launch in July. So you can DM me to get more information about this. But this is one of the many issues that we talk about in Life Camp, because although it is more subtle, it's nevertheless really problematic. And so we love to bring up these topics there and these issues and help to untangle and address not only some of the behavioral issues in your world, but really looking at the physiological relationship between your behaviors and your thoughts and how they are creating your everyday experience. So if you have any questions about this, throw them below in the comments. I'm happy to answer them for you. And I will look forward to hearing from you all. Thanks.
Hey, it's Ruby. Now we want to hear from you. What's one insight or action you're taking away from today's episode of Life Camp TV? Put that in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. While you're at it, if you liked this video, go ahead and click like. You can subscribe for future updates or save it for later. Share with a friend. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time on Life Camp TV.